Commander 46, I realized my kludge here for the Japanese resistance table. I don't know what I was doing, but I looked at each Pacific Front objective. Well, there aren't that many of them that are actually under Japanese control. This is the Pacific Front here. So that's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I get Chungking, Singapore, Manila. Each one of them is worth 1, so that puts me to 8. But each island group that the Japanese ever controlled at maximum expansion counts. So now we're at 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I don't think there are any island groups here officially. I'm not sure. 13, the Kurils. So I don't think we would have hit something where there was a penalty. And then in addition, all these Japanese unbuilt units, you know, Japan's just hosed so bad. I'm just going to leave it as it is, but the U.S. probably could have gotten itself down to Wake by this point. Oh well. I don't know what the hell I'm doing. You can see the German force in France dissolved. They did some damage, taking Allied troops that were back adjacent to them for no apparent reason out of play. That was probably a mistake, having units near them that they could actually hurt. We're going to have to build up some sort of line against the Allies. There's a bunch of troops we can build, there's no question. There's a bunch of troops we can't build, too. Over on the Russian side, things worked okay, too. Here, we managed to do an attrition grab. The Vistula line is, again, kind of somewhat cohesive. And, we'll see what the Russians can do in order to push forward. Germany's not going to fall this turn, but they're not going to last much longer, which makes the fact that they're going to have an atomic bomb ready in winter kind of a moot point. But we got to get over to the Japanese now, which I don't expect them to do much. Axis turn, and you may have noticed this, I don't know, I don't think I mentioned it. They made the diplomatic overtures to Spain and ended up triggering them as an allied country. Now, Spain can't send their troops streaming into France. They're only allowed to operate anywhere in the Mediterranean. But I could SR through France if need be. I could also do naval operations with those troops. It's not as interesting as I thought it would be. I thought they'd be able, one way or the other, to threaten France, but they're actually not allowed to, which is different, at least from the old Third Reich. I don't remember about advanced Third Reich handling of them. Now, during the Allied turn, they triggered what turns out to be a surrender in Turkey. But this is kind of weird. So, the diplomatic charts don't indicate that these might be surrenders. What they indicated was, hey, Turkey's going to give 10 BRPs a turn to the Allies. No, it's actually a full surrender. I looked up in the big rule book because I'm like, well, what happens to the German troops? Turkey just disintegrates. All its territory becomes pro-Allied, but the Axis units that are in it are temporarily in supply for their next player turn, which means they're going to have some opportunity to try to get into supply. The Germans could try to grab Ankara or something. However, this is a very bad situation for the German troops. The only thing that they have kind of a nice factor about is that these Germans here are going to prevent any kind of SRing going through, or TRing, or whatever it is, going through Turkey very easily, although naval SRs could get in there. The Allies probably want to make sure that they garrison Ankara, because otherwise the Germans can pretty much get all the benefits for Turkey. The one thing they can't get is they won't get any value out of Iraq, because they're not going to have, yeah, I mean, at this point they don't have control of enough hexes to trace a line there, and in other cases they won't actually, chances are the Allied forces are going to be able to cut off the Axis from being able to have that supply line. Since they surrendered to the Western Allies, that means the Russians are going to have to get their butts out. Okay, as the turn's plans for the Allies start to solidify, and honestly, I've mentioned this before, I don't totally follow the sequence of play. That might cause problems, like, I would be more careful probably in opposed play, but I find this one of the real charms of this game as compared to the whiff system. In whiff, you have to follow the sequence of play. You're going to screw things up so totally. Here, it's a little easier to slice it up a little bit more. It still is dangerous. It's not like, say, Terrible Swift Sword, where you can really start abstracting away the rules pretty easily in terms of things and start piecing things up. But anyway, over here, we've got a naval invasion happening on the Danish coast, and the Germans decided to contest this. Now, this is going to be problematic because I've got a whole bunch of air that's going to support the Allied invasion. The question is which way I want to support it, whether I want to support the naval opportunity or whatever. But this is sort of the last chance for the German Navy to do anything, so I figure I'll do it. There's no national will cost like there is in, say, Le Grand Guerre, or presumably, which I just ordered because, I was holding off because I'm always kind of skeptical about compass games, but I'm picking up Balance of Power there. Yeah, I'm buying too many damn games again. This was all stuff that I looked at earlier and said, all right, let's see how it plays out in terms of how people end up liking things. Because honestly, pre-order prices are not that much less, or are not always less at all, than what you can get from online retailers and such not, or from sales. I would rather give the money directly to the company. Personal preference. I see no reason, to support online sellers, and online sellers undercut brick and mortar, and I don't know. Well, it's just a matter that, like, I kind of find it a shame that the most of the companies end up charging more for the games, still trying to support the retailer model. They should at least be able to come down to what the online retailers do in general. Anyway, so we've got this invasion going on. I think the German fleet's going to get pieced because of the air commitment, but the thing is, the more air that I commit to the naval battle, the less likely I am to be able to use that air effectively somewhere else. But I've got so much air back here, it's really not an issue, and I don't feel like strategic bombing is terribly a big goal for the Allies anymore. They're going to use their tactical air as much as possible tactically, rather than try to up their bombing odds, because the Germans haven't even been building all their interceptors. You can see they're getting a shortfall of them coming forward. I'm just making sure I don't have any more counter air going on. The only exception would be that the Germans can counter air as they're sailing into this battle. As part of the battle, which is probably ineffective because they don't have a lot of air here. I mean, they're really just going to get hosed, but it's a matter of destroy as much of the British fleet as possible before it can get to Japan. Not that there's a lot of time for it to get there. So far, I've been allowing the capital ships to concentrate fire, which is not in the rules at all. I'm going to try the pairing off at this point. The thing is, I see what would happen with the pairing off, and I see why it's chosen. It gives the battleships more lasting power and more decision-making chances to withdraw. So you know, I'm going to have a single 5-point ship pairing against the damaged ship here. And that would mean I have some chance of destroying it, but not much. Ships have much more capability to disengage under this condition. I'm not sure I really believe in this, though. Here's the thing. There weren't a lot of surface combats. So however you want to judge how surface combats in World War II would come out is somewhat of a fantasy projection. If you take the World War I model, the fleets did operate in formation, and they streamed in and shot it out at each other. If you look at, say, the Bismarck activity, they concentrated fire on the Bismarck. That's why I don't really believe that this pairing off makes a great deal of sense. On the other hand, Le Grand Guerre makes the same situation. And it would make sense to me that you can't massively concentrate. But it doesn't take massive concentration from the battleships to really do a lot of damage. I just don't know which way to go with it. The pairing off adds a level of mechanical complexity to the game that I just feel is going too far, given the lack of such detail that's going on over here. And the old system, I don't remember about the Rising Sun, whether that was just lifted completely. No, obviously not. There were no capital ships. So the old system always just had, you have factors, they fire at each other. This is close to what I'm doing, which is allocate your fire at the various targets. And honestly, which one makes more sense is hard to judge. The designer obviously intended to give the battleships more staying power in terms of they would just get damaged, all of them, across the board, and you'd have more opportunities to break off. I have not been doing that, and I kind of don't want to here, because it's just going to delay things, is really what it's going to do. Now, it does have an effect on the battle itself, because if you can concentrate fire, you can take out a couple of key units, you can make a task force weak, without giving your opponent an opportunity to make it weak themselves. Because damage doesn't really matter until it hits the damaged level. So, you know, there's conceivably conditions in which you might force a task force to be weaker, like if the opponent's making a last gamble, then he would allow it to be under the normal combat. But I just don't see that little gain as being worth the extra effort. And I don't think it made much difference, because the airstrikes were the dominant factor here. The Germans have a couple of destroyers left. They're pulling out. That can't win a fight. And I do have a battleship still potentially available. So, you know, there's some possibility that I may be able to rebuild, you know, another naval action, or at least enough of a threat that the Allies have to keep some extra ships there. I think the one thing that it did affect was that the Duke of York, by concentrating fire on it, I was able to destroy it. Otherwise, well, this thing wouldn't have been damaged maybe as early, but the British just have so much power here that they were able to essentially drive the German fleet into destruction pretty easily. Now, what I have to do, and where I kind of cheated, is I wanted to resolve the naval interception before I figure out all these land attacks. I did move down here, and this is where I get screwy with the sequence of play, right? I did move down there, but I didn't want to figure these out until I resolved the naval, because the naval situation would destroy my mental image of what I'm doing, my memory of what I'm doing. So, you know, I shouldn't have even done these, but I'm going to hold off on the invasion itself because that can have an effect on things, but I don't feel like the results of the naval combat were going to affect my decisions terribly. One thing I want to point out, I thought there was going to be a crossing arrow here between Gibraltar and Spanish Morocco. There is not. So I dispatched some destroyers in order to help me SR a few Spaniards up into Turkey, which is where they're going to go. The Allied advance to the north was not present, really. I mean, they failed there. So their exploitation was not as successful as I expected. However, the Russians managed to break through, taking Warsaw, Berlin, pretty much everything. Bremen. These guys are all pocketed. These guys theoretically have supply from the minor country, but that's going to be tough to justify very shortly. Simply, we're going to have to see what happens. But as far as what I can see, Germany has lost everything that they own. Now, they don't necessarily surrender. So this is one of the things that's always bugged me about the Third Reich, well, at least the advanced Third Reich surrender rules. They're based on your diplomatic points. And as the year goes forward, your money decreases and your diplomatic points decrease. So later in the year, you become more capable of surrendering for some reason. There's just this weird, refreshing situation that happens every spring. You might argue to some extent it might make sense. Hey, the weather is getting better, people are less depressed or something. I'm not sure why summer is easier to surrender in than spring, all other things being equal. Anyway, it's just always been this weird thing. It can often mean a couple of points, but here's the thing. Germany's got to be really hosed with what they just lost. If they don't make back any of this, and I don't see how they can. They don't have an army, really. They could. I got to look at their supply because they may not have any supply. Essentially, these guys down here. There's none of their economic centers are under their control, which I think means they basically are hosed, and they're going to have so many unbuilt units, so much money in the hole, etc. I think we are going to see a German surrender. And that's, it looks like it should apply at this point. The alternative rules for a German surrender are control of every hex in Germany, which is not the case yet. There's still a significant number of hexes that are not controlled by the Allies, but we'll see what turns there. They don't surrender until the end of the German turn at the very least, and that'll allow me to start turning my effort towards Japan. I was already beginning to shift forces, and I'll start shifting Russians into the Urals for their declaration of war. But generally, it looks like things are over. Now, Italy is still holding out, and they actually held well on the line here against an attack, which I was planning on exploiting through, but that didn't happen. And we can't really do any bombing of Italy because all of our bombers are deployed over there to Germany. That'll switch very quickly. But right now I've got to move to the Pacific. In the victory conditions, one thing that seems really weird. So, okay, the Axis is going to win this game overall. And I could still make this judgment between Allied and Russian powers, but it's not really baked into the system. So there's kind of okay, who came in second? Because honestly, the war was won by the Allies here. There's no question that that's going to happen. Every time you break this game open, the Allies are going to win, I think. I don't think, short of, and it would have been possible maybe, trying to make a sea line or something. But the problem is the U.S. came in so quickly into the war because of Gathering Storm. But anyway, short of something really intensive like taking Russia and Britain both out, I think the Allies win this one no matter what. So then the question becomes, well, it's kind of weird not to assess the after-war status. Of course, you can do it at your option, but there's no consideration baked into the rules of a second or third place in it or anything like that. The old one used to give points. You got different levels of victory, and it was a more complex system in the original Third Reich, and I don't know if that persisted into these, where you really kind of judged, okay, what do I have at the end? And the game ended in 45, I think. If Germany had any objectives left, they got at least a marginal victory. If Italy had any, they got a major victory. They were determined by what date they ended. But, that didn't really work terribly well either, because honestly, so much of it's in the choice of the Allies. Who do we knock out first? So Italy surviving to this point would be a major victory, and they'd win the game. Or whatever. I mean, even surviving into like mid-45 or something. They win the game, even though the Allies were doing pretty well. They just made a strategic choice to ignore Italy until last or whatever. And that didn't make a lot of sense either. It's just a matter of, I don't understand playing a game like this terribly competitively. And the problem with this one is there's not an interesting result in terms of the Axis being able to win. It's not very easy either. So I don't know. And I don't think it should be. I don't think it should be possible within any reasonable stretch for the Axis to win the war. World War I, maybe. The Central Powers should have a decent shot. This, not unless you start taking into account national will at a level which this game does not. Which means essentially it's possible to bolster Britain, Russia, whatever, to such a point where they're not going to surrender. China. It's possible to give them enough aid with the U.S. that really, unless the U.S. screws up or totally doesn't want them to do well, you can pretty much keep anybody in the game. I usually don't give any aid to Russia because usually in Third Reich, they're perfectly capable of surviving. Just as we didn't see that in World in Flames. World in Flames, we saw Russia collapse, but I cheated there for the Axis pretty heavily. Here I'm probably cheating for the Allies, and unintentionally, of course. So the Allies are frittering away their forces to help. I think I'm going to go for Moresby anyhow, because it's under the air cover, to help prepare for invasions down here, Rubble, Moresby. I'm going to go after the Moresby because that's a little more protected from the Japanese fleet. Now, the Japanese fleet is all the way back in Japan. They can actually intercept. They've got the ports requirement, if that's a requirement for interception. I don't think it is. And they can make that strike. But likewise, they could also make a strike because we've got a force on patrol here, and we're going to have an invasion force striking. So I've got to kind of make my decision. I've got three different choices. I could go for this, or I could go for the patrol up here. I'm not sure. This might be a sequence of play thing where I'd kind of have to make the patrol choice first. I can look that up. I don't have much of a fleet, but I can probably handle this if I can catch it. And that's the difficulty to the whole thing. You see what the sequence is like, because I don't want to be too silly. We did the counter air. When do we declare our naval actions? We announce naval base changes. Yeah, so we do the patrols first. So we see the base change coming down here, and we know it's going to be a possibility. This is too much to handle. But on the other hand, this may not be doing much. It's probably going to succeed if I don't block it, though. It was made instead to cover Moresby, and that was unsuccessful. We didn't catch them. Hey, that's kind of cool. We don't need any oil. On the other hand, if we're going to be using our Navy, we may need oil. But we can take the oil effect for the Navy and then decide whether or not to try to make an interception. But the U.S. gains both Wake and Moresby. Over here, they're trimming things down using attrition. The communists ran into something too big to attack. I mean, they could, but it would have been a 1-to-1 attack. Maybe worthwhile compared to the kind of slow amount of losses they can cause on the 1 to 10 table or whatever they're on. But it's hard to make that decision, especially since I got the Soviets coming in and they can operate with the communist Chinese. Of course, once the Soviets come in any force, which at the very least I'm sending most of this up there, they'll be able to do a lot of damage. That initial force probably isn't much more than it can invade Manchuria, but if they get significant other forces, they'll be able to do quite a bit. So, we're seeing the collapse of this of that defensive perimeter. Remember, we did cheat essentially a U.S. turn away with the election result, which shouldn't have happened. So, things could be significantly worse. I haven't done my economic warfare. The victory conditions in this game, which I gripe about a little bit, might force the Russians into behavior that maybe they wouldn't necessarily be in favor of. So, for example, the question of whether you bomb Japan if you've got the capabilities, or throw rockets at Japan, stuff like that. That all kind of fits under this, okay, is that going to increase Japanese surrender, or do I have more time to move this way? Do I want to utilize those? And that's kind of a weird situation where you would actually reduce your force on Japan itself because you want to gather more territory. But then comes this whole question of, hey, am I looking to knock Japan out early so that they don't win by as much by losing so late in the game? Or am I more worried about that American-Soviet balance, the post-war balance? And it's a weird situation because obviously if the Allies are winning, the Russians want to do whatever it will take to improve their own victory over the over the Western Allies. But what does it mean in this circumstance? Do I want to, hurry up Japan's surrender, which doesn't even really mean anything? In terms of the game, Japan is getting a better and better victory condition the longer they last, but do I care about that at all? Or am I caring about the post-war period? And I mean, this is the kind of context that is much easier in the World in Flames environment where, it's assumed the Axis is actually trying to win the war, at least under the Days of Decision game. I'm not so sure. I don't remember if the real World in Flames had this kind of victory condition in it. And my poor Spaniards couldn't make it. I have no transport. Oh, I actually do. I left some for them. So wait a minute, I left them 3 destroyers, so I can move an armor and an air over here. And the armor will hook back up. Actually, I got a lot of armor there, I don't know what to do. I got so much force coming through and so little to do with it. It's going to get ugly when I cross over, but not that terribly ugly. I mean, I'm outnumbered, but I got better stuff by so much. And I still got to go get Baghdad, I guess. I don't know. I can't just charge through that because it's not controlled territory. Turkey's controlled because they surrendered. The artificial end of the game in winter of 46 is prompting me towards not taking oil effects. Japan took two oil that they expended instead. This will allow them to make a big push, right? I don't know what that big push is worth. They're losing the war. If they followed kind of the strategy that they've been following, they probably would have taken at least one oil effect. In terms of, they probably would have taken the construction effect. But hey, you know, I only got 3 turns left. I can probably last those out, right? Maybe. We don't know, because we don't know how bad their transport situation is going to be. Their shipbuilding's been taxed to the limit. Meanwhile, over on the Axis side, well, the Italian Navy isn't really planning on doing anything, and the construction oil effect is pretty much unimportant. I expect Germany to fall this turn. I did a quick calculation. It looks like they're going to be at about -3 with all the hits that they've taken. Assuming they don't have any big chunks of money left. Now, they're losing a lot of cash in this upcoming turn. But they actually do have a significant amount kicking around. Let's see, they had 300 and something. If they don't regain anything, they're losing a big chunk of that. I think they're still going to end up at -1, especially as, you know, we're probably going to see, well, they may not surrender this turn. Yeah, that's one effect, but they're not going to be able to do much because they have no supplies. I don't think they're even in limited supply. Well, over here they are. And then they can trace, these guys can trace, I believe. Oh, there's probably an armor there now. And these guys are cut off. These guys are in limited supply. And then, oh no, they're not. There's an armor here blocking them. So yeah, these guys are not in supply because I don't think there's any key locations up here. So anyway, the German army isn't going to be able to do much, is I guess the point. Now, maybe cheating with these Swedes, I don't know. I don't really care. I'm not sure if they can get to Denmark. They should be allowed to, right? Started shipping. And I switched them over to my U.S. fleets because those are what I use over in the Pacific. Ideally, I would rather have the little British flags flying around, but it's too hard to get them here. So until I kind of clear this map, and unless I do, I'm going to do it that way. So anyway, you know, we see some kind of irregular behavior going on. Also, the entire Allied Air Force has moved over into the Mediterranean to try to knock Italy out pretty hard. Yeah, whatever. It's not like I can bomb the German industry anymore. It doesn't exist. It's been conquered. Germans did indeed surrender. Italy is a weird case. They're at like +1 if you don't take a modifier into effect that Gathering Storm really screws with, which has to do with the year. The Italians take a penalty the later they get into the war if they're the ones who declare war. And they declared war here. Since the game didn't start in 42, that was the earliest they could declare war. Normally the game, you know, World War II in Europe starts in 39, and they get a penalty, I think, in 41 and 42, and onward, of course, -1 and -2. Now, if we shift this game forward, it would mean 43 and 44, and I'm fine, and that's how I'm going to play it. The Italians have 1 point, like I said, which means if they lose anything, including well, money isn't going to matter. They didn't get a bonus from money. But basically, if they get a firestorm or anything like that, and the entire bomber fleet has moved against Italy, so they're pretty much assured to surrender. The surrender actually happens at the end of the Allied turn. for what it matters. Now, everything in the mid shifts over to the Italians, but not the minor allies. They're still destroyed and surrender. It's just Italy now controls their territory. The other territory for minors is sort of neutral. It can't be diplomatized or anything like that, so the Russians aren't going to get a quick ally. Not that it matters much unless you were going to do a slug it out with the West scenario. Instead, it's just a whoever races to get there first is going to get the victory points for this. I'll probably score them. I'm not sure. But yeah, Germany's out of the game. Their oil still counts for the Italians, though. The Italians are dependent on that. I ruled Iraq can't go over to Italy, to Italian control. That's actually probably wrong. The Iraqi territories are probably still conquered by Italy. It's not a minor power. So, put a little flag there too. But no matter what, the U.S. would have to go capture Baghdad to take Iraq. So that's, it's kind of unimportant. The oil's not getting out of here. But it is an objective hex, so it's of some value that way. And that's about it. Nope, there goes Malta. That's Italian. Yay. I don't know if it's worth playing out the occupation of those territories, but I should at least do the Italian surrender once it comes about. What Japan's going to do, I don't know. We'll see. And the Japanese centralized their fleet over at Guam. They fortified it a little further, built up some fortifications over here in Palembang. I don't know why. Singapore is probably more important, but in terms of being able, I don't know. Access is access. The Brits can land in Palembang and they can take the oil away. However, there are other open spaces. Doesn't really look like the Brits can get even to Batavia. See, I'm worried about the fleets that are here in South Africa, which can transfer to Ceylon or up here to Rangoon, Bangkok, and possibly cause problems. But Singapore's dominance here makes it very, very difficult, so I may have to actually shift those fleets down to Australia to do anything that'll take another turn of action. This is a nice position. I can help protect against Tokyo. I can protect against my holdings down in the Pacific itself. So it looks appealing to me. Built up some infantry. It's not going to stop the Russians, but yeah, who knows, you know. And I've actually got some Navy, some additional naval factors that may come into play very shortly. We'll see what we can hold out, you know, how long we can hold. It's going to take a while, but one thing to note, these are all U.S. atomic bombs. They got their plutonium research completed, and that's a lot faster, and they had factories online. So they were, the only thing they didn't have was a trigger for the plutonium bomb, and now they have that. So all their material for the bombs is just quickly turned into bombs. So they could just level Japan with A-bombs. However, they do have to get within range. I don't know what their range is. We've got currently an air range of 2, and that's not going to go any higher. Now that's I think 16 hexes in Europe, so it's probably 8 hexes here, and we're not 8 hexes away, so we got to get somewhere. Ujima would work. Okinawa, obviously. How about Guam's too far. If we had a little bit more bombing capability, we could do it. If we had ports in China that we could access, we could do it. But as it stands right now, we don't have anywhere we can launch those planes from. What about here? Not quite. Alrighty. And we're actually building up our our transport fleet pretty nicely, just devoting most of our naval builds to that instead of to a fleet. I don't know if we really need to be doing that anymore, but yeah. Well, it appears to me that an Italian surrender is absolutely imminent. They were like at 1 point. They're going to lose possibly points. I don't know if they have anything in Southern Europe that's going to fall automatically. But they're going to lose 1 point guaranteed for Milan falling. They got paratroops able to take that. It's their own fault they didn't defend it. But honestly, they're probably going to get firestormed in Rome, and it's really not, something worth considering too heavily. At that point, it becomes kind of there's an interesting situation where, like, Budapest, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the Brits can get there. Remember. Yeah, I know, I should know this. Well, look, I don't think rivers cost. Yeah, rivers don't cost a movement cost. I didn't think so, but I haven't been playing them as such, but then I realized here I am tracing it. What the hell? I better be careful, right? So, yes, the Brits could reach Budapest, but the Russians can reach it at only 3 movement points. So it becomes kind of a who can get there the firstest. Americans here, 1, 2, 3, 4 movement points away. I don't think there's anything Russian that's going to be able to get into Romania. And we're just going to kind of divide things up without too much thought. So a lot of the effort that's going to be going into place right now is going to be trying to get Allied forces overseas so that they can, work their way back either through South Africa, quite possibly, or conceivably here. But I would much rather get the force deployed into the Southeast Asia theater and down here where it's kind of hard for me to get troops. So I'm probably going to focus more through South Africa rather than any kind of real concentration on Italy. This is done. It's just really a matter of trying to determine what the scoring is. And I won't worry too much about getting that exact. Capture of Milan and Genoa is sufficient to force the Italian surrender. So I don't see a reason to drop a ton of bombs into Rome or whatever, which I could do. So our line actually is going to be East Germany, Hungary. Romania is losing Bessarabia, I guess. It doesn't matter. It's not worth any victory points. Finland's going to fall for whatever that matters. But basically the Soviets have lost the European war pretty heavily, I think, simply because they were delayed for so long. The same thing that kept the Germans from having to face them. The gathering storms, situation heavily impacted the Soviet versus Western Allied commitment. You can see the Americans basically have swept in. They're gonna lose Serbia. I think that's gonna fall to the Russians because we're only 2 hexes away. So that's just how I'm gonna allocate it all out, and then I'll score that. Meanwhile, I'm beginning to ship things over. I didn't send any of the fleets currently here because, well, they kind of had to protect the fleets that were moving out of the way against the potential Italian interception or something, I guess. So that is the end of the European war, and now we worry over here. Russia's declaring war, and we see how this all plays out. Over in the Pacific, the U.S. sends their main battle fleet over here into the Carolines. It's going to be hard to take Guam, so, as long as the Navy's there, I'd have to airstrike it or something like that. That makes for a complicated scenario. So why don't I just take Truk instead, which is actually really valuable to me. I like the idea of a double port. I was considering making Guam a double port. There's nothing else I have within range. I have to be essentially 10 hexes of this port. So that's what we're going to do. And that screens the attack that I'm going to make over here on Rabaul, which I pre-plotted or whatever, but as well as I'll be able to make the attack here. So now the Japanese have to make their decision. Do they want to fight, you know, my main task force, or do they want to wait a little bit? And I think wait is the best option, because all I have is really one big fleet of carriers. Those tend to be very weak. I mean, it's not just carriers. There's some big battleships and everything in there. The problem is I don't have that much capability to build more of anything in the near future. The problem being that I have to keep spending points over there to keep my my oil supplies going. So that's definitely a worry. So it might be of value to just throw the Navy away at this point. I've won either way. It's really, you know, because I'm lasting out long enough. Same thing over on the European map. They lasted long enough, they won. And yeah, I've started clearing up things that, you know, I'm really just doing this to kind of show some of the island hopping techniques. But I don't really want to fight a naval battle, so, you know, I'll let the invasion go. You see the Russian attack, which has taken most of Manchuria. This guy's going to be icy. Oh no, it'll be partially supplied. The drive on Peking, though, was not good. It ended up destroying both forces. There's not a lot of room for the Japanese to get back in there. They're going to lose it pretty quickly. Communists are being used, Communist Chinese, as really a battering ram to try to blast away some of the Japanese. And not much happening down here with the monsoon. I couldn't move around, and the attrition roll wasn't very impressive. As a sanity check, I wanted to check the Japanese surrender levels, because I don't really know what they are. It didn't feel like we were close at any point. Well, we're a lot closer than I thought. They have weird things factored in. For one thing, they get points for... they don't have a diplomacy table, which means they don't get points for having lots of money kicking around. But they get points for island groups that they conquered at any point in the game. So I've got, or owned, so I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 extra points that are kind of kicking around. Like I said, there aren't any over here. But they also lost about 4 points due to the massive amounts of troops that they don't have constructed. So they come out to a total of 2 right now, which very quickly could have, they could have surrendered this turn. Had they lost Harbin and Peking, they'd be out of the game already. And then it becomes the race for who can get to what. But yeah, so they're not in terribly solid condition. I'm probably not going to be having to drop a nuke on them. So for example, Kwajalein, that's one point that they have that could have easily have fallen. Now, they lost 2 objectives this turn, so I think the duties have been being done. The objectives over here don't count against them. It's only the Pacific ones that count against their surrender chances, which means this huge force coming in through South Africa really isn't going to be able to do much to them. There's some forces, 8, 9, and 10. Do I have any destroyers out there? No, I don't. I have a big battleship fleet and everything, but no destroyers down there. Oh well. At this point, I think I'm going to call it, just because there's nothing but bookkeeping left. I have a significant amount of bookkeeping to buy U.S. forces. They're not going to make a difference, right? We're going to be able to take Kwajalein, if that's what we want, and Harbin. And that'll reduce the extent of the Japanese victory, unless we're playing out some sort of, hey, what's the world going to come to? I just don't see much point to it. I can look and make a fair estimate of what the Russians are going to pick up. They're going to get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 total in the east. That's it. they're not going to cross this line when Japan surrenders. So if we're looking at 6 in the east, well, yeah, but they can probably pick up, actually, these two, call it 8, just because they'll be the closest to them, closer than the nationalist Chinese. So that's like 8 to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. Russians can't get anywhere at sea. 20, 21. I mean, there's going to be a huge amount of these going over to the U.S. So the post-war world is going to be even less pro-Soviet than it was historically. There's nothing that's going to change that. The European map fixture saying Russia only got East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Finland, which doesn't count, and that the Western Europeans have things like Spain and Sweden allied with them, and Turkey, or at least under their dominance at this point. They got lucky in Serbia. The partisans were as far away as the Russian troops. I thought the Russians were going to get Serbia. So yeah, I think rather than waste more of my time on something kind of inconsequential in terms of there's just nothing that exciting that's going to happen. I'm not going to be able to launch an atomic bomb against Japan or anything like that. The best that I really can see myself doing is probably these fleets, if they're in place, will be able to take something like Singapore or some of these. None of that matters. Those are all going to fall to the Western Allies no matter what. Whereas, we're almost certain for the game to end at this point. The longer we let it run out, the more chance the Russians have to push deeper into China. And I'm going to look up the points, see if I'm correct that it's actually a purely balanced thing, or if the Russians just need some proportion. Clearly not going to make it either way, but the Russians, with the 7 or so victory points that they can get in the east, added to the 13 that I counted for them in the west, that's going to put them very, very low at the 0 level if this was an Allied victory. Now, what else would there be? Well, they didn't get any nuclear activity because they got screwed in the tech race, and actually they were trying, but this is quite possible, and this obviously skews the victory completely. But they had a problem with controlled reaction, which means they can't get any of the atomic values at all, except for I think they get 1 point for the atomic general result, whereas the Allies have many, many more. They have a point for each atomic bomb they haven't used. Well, that's that stack, They just totally outclass them. But the important story is over here, which is that the European Axis went down in summer of 46, which gives them a +4 victory level. That has nothing to do with these points. And you know what? Japan also went down in summer of 46. Not, if I count that, hey, I cheated. And so they have a +3. Well, that's kind of weird. It bakes in the idea that you're going to go Europe first, I guess, to some extent. Certainly, whichever one you focus on, it is more likely to fall. So the more important thing is you add those together and get some kind of value. And obviously the Axis did very well. That's not too surprising given the Gathering Storm result, which, if we think about it, looked very, very good for the Axis. They had almost, they had total control of the game during that, and got to decide when the war started and under what terms. But oddly enough, it didn't feel like they were as affected in Europe the major thing that they got there was, hey, we don't have to worry about Russia. So the war of choice in Russia became a real choice, where it usually isn't in most, certainly in any Third Reich game, but in most of the, or base game, but also in most World War II games, you're kind of forced into the, well, if I don't attack Russia, they're going to attack me. The only exception to that maybe is World in Flames Days of Decision. If you're playing the crazy scenario, you could come to an agreement with Russia, and that might actually be a very interesting game, simply because the U.S. is so potent there that you might see some very shifting alliances. And I'm kind of intrigued to play that. There are some restrictions on how easily you can move around. It's not like playing a game of diplomacy, right? We did see some really weird things, though, where some value showing up in Gathering Storm, say the Italian carrier fleet, didn't really translate to combat ability on the board. Now, the overall strength of the Italian fleet, and I built it up quite a bit, might be why there was only one Italian five-factor air unit, or I might have dropped it somewhere into a bag. The overall strength of the Italian fleet did keep the Mediterranean, and it allowed me to take Malta. It gave me quite a bit of control over the Med. On the other hand, when it was actually challenged to a fight, those carriers were just crap. Because I didn't invest any points in air research for the Axis as a whole, and because the Italians start off a point worse at everything than the Germans do. Other technological results definitely had an influence on things, and there's a lot of luck based on those results, just like there's a fair amount of luck based on these. Now, I didn't use these to really inform my strategy. You kind of got to do what you got to do when you got to do it. You can't geez, I have a handful of crap, I'm going to pass, unless the theater's really close. If the theater's closely balanced, you may not want to engage if you have a handful of crap in the magic cards. Likewise, if the naval situation is really closely balanced over in Europe, yeah, this might not be the turn for an invasion. There's no question I made mistakes, both strategically, tactically, and rules-wise throughout. So you're not getting an absolutely, and you never will with me, an absolutely fair view of what the game is like. Even games that I play a lot of, I make mistakes in. So there we have that. I'll come back with a review. Largely, probably comparing this experience with the World in Flames Days of Decision, because I think these are the two games closest. And then I will be doing the grand comparison, but I've got one more game to do. As I said, I got to do Triumph and Tragedy. It's too bad Cataclysm's not out. Churchill's not really the same kind of game, so I don't feel too bad leaving that alone. Although, to tell you the truth, there are, in terms of the grand strategic World War II games, there are a lot of different categories within that, and I'm gonna probably be picking out. I'm gonna be picking out the games that I have, but they actually turn out to be kind of the big names too in a lot of ways, and I think each one does something very good on its own. Anyway, that's enough of babbling about that. I've got a huge cleanup task to take care of before I can give you a review.